Clara Bennett was 27 and had nowhere that still felt like home. For days after her grandmother vanished, she drove back to the century-old family bakery on Main Street in Stowe, Vermont, with a single suitcase, a temporary power of attorney, and the quiet certainty that she was only staying long enough to settle whatever remained. The sheriff had already searched every room. The front windows were dark behind a thin layer of flour dust. A handwritten notice announcing a temporary closure still hung crooked on the door. Everyone in town believed Margaret Bennett had simply disappeared between locking the bakery for the evening and sunrise the next morning. Yet when Clara stepped inside, the unmistakable fragrance of freshly baked sourdough drifted through the silent shop, warm enough to stop her where she stood. The brick oven should have been cold. No flour deliveries had arrived in 3 days. No customer had crossed the threshold since Margaret went missing. Still, a single round loaf rested on the wooden cooling rack, its crust softly crackling as faint wisps of steam rose into the dim afternoon light. Clara did not call out. She had spent too many years learning that hope could sound foolish when spoken aloud. Instead, she crossed the familiar floorboards and lifted the old cream-colored linen cloth her grandmother had always used to cover rising bread. The fabric still carried the scent of flour and yeast, and for a moment it felt less like kitchen linen than the last piece of childhood she had never managed to leave behind. She folded it carefully over one arm instead of putting it away. Then she made her first decision. Rather than waiting for another phone call from the sheriff or another polite suggestion to leave everything untouched, she would reopen the kitchen, inspect every corner herself, and finish whatever her grandmother had started. As she reached for the heavy iron handle of the brick oven, something metallic struck softly against the inner wall, followed by a slow, unmistakable scrape from somewhere beyond the warming chamber. The slow scrape came once, then stopped. Clara waited beside the brick oven without moving, one hand still wrapped around the warm iron handle, while the other held the folded cream-colored linen cloth against her forearm. She listened until the bakery settled back into silence. Old buildings always spoke in small sounds, she reminded herself. Expanding brick, cooling metal, dry timber adjusting after years of use. That was what any reasonable baker would believe. Even so, she pulled the oven door open with deliberate care. The loaf remained exactly where she had first seen it, its crust blistered to the same deep amber her grandmother had always called the color of patience. Nothing inside appeared disturbed. Only a narrow metal peel leaned farther back than Clara remembered, its wooden grip resting against the rear wall as though someone had returned it in haste. She reached for it instinctively, turning the long handle through practiced fingers. The polished wood carried a faint groove near the middle, worn smooth by decades of steady hands. That familiar shape drew her backward without warning. She was 8 again, standing on the same stone floor, while Margaret patiently corrected the angle of her wrists instead of taking the peel away. Bread, her grandmother had insisted, could sense hurry before people could. If Clara forced the dough, the loaf tightened. If she learned to wait, it opened on its own. The lesson had sounded foolish to a child. Years later, in culinary school outside Portland, the same patience became the habit that earned her the most difficult fermentation work in every kitchen. She had learned temperatures by touch, hydration by sight, and timing by smell long before she trusted timers or digital scales. Those skills had built her career. They had also made it easier to keep people at the same careful distance she kept from unfinished dough. She returned to the present and laid the linen cloth across the work table before lifting the peel once more. A dusting of fresh flour clung to its blade. Fresh, not days old. She rubbed it gently between her fingers. The particles were still soft enough to gather instead of drifting apart. Someone had baked here far more recently than the sheriff believed. Or perhaps Margaret had measured everything. Before she disappeared, Clara chose the simpler explanation, though it settled uneasily inside her. As she slid the peel back into its rack, something caught her eye beneath the handle. A tiny crescent of dark blue paint on the iron bracket, no larger than a fingernail, where no paint should have been at all. Clara left the blue paint exactly where she found it. She closed the oven door, folded the cream-colored linen cloth into a careful square, and slipped it into the canvas tote she had brought from Portland. If the bakery still held answers, she wanted every choice she made from this moment forward to leave as little disturbance as possible. Before touching anything else, She locked the front entrance again and walked 3 blocks to the law office of Linda Foster, the attorney who had called 4 days earlier with news that Margaret Bennett had named Clara temporary custodian of the bakery if anything ever prevented her from running it herself. The arrangement had surprised everyone, including Clara. She had visited only twice in the previous 6 years. She had never expected responsibility, only the quiet obligation of helping settle an estate someday. Linda slid a worn file across the oak conference table. Inside were the signed power of attorney, the temporary business authority approved by Washington County, a list of unpaid utility invoices, and a handwritten note from Margaret dated nearly 18 months earlier. It contained only one instruction: give Clara time before you give her answers. Linda admitted she had never understood what that sentence meant. Neither did Clara. The bakery owed just enough in taxes, electricity, and supplier invoices that another month of closure could force a permanent sale. A regional cafe chain had already contacted the office expressing interest in purchasing the building if the family decided not to reopen. Financially, selling would have been the sensible decision. Clara stared at the numbers until they blurred, then unfolded the linen cloth on her lap without thinking. A faint scent of yeast still lingered in its fibers. She remembered being 10 years old, hiding beneath that same cloth while her grandmother laughed and called it the safest place in the bakery because good bread could not rise if someone kept lifting the cover to check on it. Margaret had always believed some things needed quiet before they revealed themselves. Clara folded the cloth again and made her decision. She would keep the bakery operating long enough to learn why her grandmother had prepared for her return years in advance. If nothing meaningful emerged, she could still sell later. Linda nodded but offered one unexpected warning before handing over the original brass keys. People around here will tell you the old oven keeps its own secrets, she said with a tired smile. Most of them mean the building. A few mean your grandmother. I am still not sure those are different things. Outside, the afternoon carried the smell of fallen maple leaves and cooling brick. On her walk back, Ethan Cole, whose family had supplied flour to the bakery for decades, was unloading sacks from an empty truck. He greeted Clara kindly but frowned when she mentioned the warm loaf. If you find something hidden, he said after a long pause, do not assume it was hidden from you. Before she could ask what he meant, he climbed into the truck and drove away. The words followed her all the way back to Main Street. She unlocked the bakery once more, stepped inside with the brass keys still warm in her palm, and for the first time realized the heavy door to the flour cellar beneath the rear kitchen was standing slightly open. The flour cellar door had never been left open when Margaret Bennett was alive. Clara knew that with the quiet certainty reserved for habits repeated across decades. Her grandmother had treated the cellar like the heart of the bakery. Temperature mattered there. Humidity mattered. Even the way the heavy oak door closed against its iron frame mattered because flour absorbed every careless change the way bread absorbed every careless hand. She slipped the brass keys into her coat pocket, tucked the cream-colored linen cloth beneath one arm, and eased the cellar door wider. Cool air drifted upward carrying the familiar scent of grain, old wood, and limestone. It smelled clean rather than abandoned. She reached for the switch beside the stairs. Nothing happened. The power to the cellar lights had failed sometime before the sheriff searched the building. Instead of retreating, Clara found a rechargeable work lamp in the maintenance cabinet near the mixing bench, checked its battery, and carried it downstairs. Years in commercial kitchens had taught her never to trust appearances before checking equipment. She moved slowly, studying each step before placing her weight on it. The original maple stair treads remained solid despite their age, but halfway down she noticed the first detail that did not belong. 3 replacement boards had been installed using modern square drive screws while every surrounding tread still held century-old slotted fasteners. Someone had repaired only that narrow section, and recently enough that the wood had not yet darkened to match the rest. At the bottom, rows of flour bins lined the stone walls exactly as she remembered, each labeled in Margaret's careful handwriting. Hard red wheat, rye, buckwheat, whole white wheat. Their lids were closed, the scoops resting neatly inside. Nothing suggested panic or abandonment. Clara checked each container anyway. The grain remained dry. No insects. No mold. Whoever had maintained this room had cared more about preservation than convenience. She made notes in a small spiral notebook before kneeling beside the aging ventilation register that controlled moisture beneath the bakery. The airflow felt stronger than it should have. She removed the iron grate and discovered the ductwork had been cleaned recently, free of the flour dust that normally gathered over months of baking. The sheriff's report had described the cellar as undisturbed. That description could no longer be true. She replaced the grate carefully and continued her inspection. The western wall supported the brick oven above, its thick masonry disappearing into the ceiling where heat traveled through the warming chamber. Clara rested one hand against the brick. The temperature surprised her. Not hot, but faintly warm despite the oven having supposedly gone unused since Margaret disappeared. Residual heat should have vanished days earlier. She considered the possibility that the dense masonry simply retained warmth longer than modern ovens. It was the explanation she wanted to believe. Still, she wrote the observation beside every other practical detail instead of trusting memory alone. As she circled the foundation, the beam from her work lamp swept across the floor and paused on something almost invisible. A narrow strip of pale mortar, only a few feet wide, differed slightly from the surrounding joints. Its color matched the older brick, yet its texture looked smoother, as though someone had repaired that section with unusual care while intentionally disguising the work. She crouched to examine it more closely. When she tapped the nearby bricks with the wooden handle of a flour scoop, most answered with the dense, reassuring sound of solid masonry. One section answered with a softer, hollow note. The difference was slight, easy to dismiss, easy to overlook. She tapped again from another angle. The hollow tone remained. Before curiosity could persuade her to pry at the mortar, she stopped herself. Damaging a century-old oven without understanding its construction would be reckless. Margaret had spent her life protecting this bakery. Clara found herself making an unexpected promise in the silence below the shop. Whatever secrets the building carried, she would uncover them without breaking the place that had carried her grandmother's hands for half a century. She folded the linen cloth over the edge of the nearest flour bin before climbing back toward the kitchen to search for the original construction drawings. As she reached the top stair, the late afternoon sun slipped through the rear window and struck the brass hinges of the cellar door. For an instant, she noticed dozens of tiny scratches circling one hinge pin, bright against the older metal, the unmistakable marks of a hinge that had been removed and reinstalled many times, though every official record insisted that door had never been altered since the bakery opened in 1919. Clara spent the next 2 mornings working through the bakery one practical task at a time, refusing to let mystery become an excuse for neglect. She balanced overdue utility payments from the business account Linda Foster had authorized, emptied stale ingredients that could no longer be trusted, and scrubbed every wooden work table until the grain shone pale beneath decades of flour dust. The rhythm steadied her. Dough bowls, measuring scales, cooling racks, proofing baskets. Each object returned to its proper place. And with every small act of order, the bakery felt less like an abandoned building and more like a promise interrupted. She unfolded the cream-colored linen cloth each morning before beginning, laying it across the largest work table exactly as Margaret always had. At first, it was simply a habit borrowed from memory. By the 3rd day, it had become something else. Whenever the cloth rested on the table, Clara found herself slowing down, looking more carefully instead of rushing toward answers. The bakery seemed to reward patience. Ethan Cole arrived shortly before noon carrying 2 50-pound sacks of fresh bread flour. Clara tried to refuse them, explaining that she could not afford another delivery until the books balanced. Ethan quietly pointed to the invoice, paid in full 2 weeks earlier. Margaret had ordered enough flour for nearly a month despite having no large catering contract scheduled. She told me not to cancel it, he said while setting the bags beside the storage bins. Said someone would need it more than she would. He did not elaborate, and Clara did not press him. Instead, she thanked him by mixing a small batch of dough from the remaining starter culture she had found alive inside the fermentation room refrigerator. The starter should have weakened after several unattended days, yet it responded vigorously, bubbling with surprising strength within hours. Attached to the glass jar by faded string was a handwritten tag Margaret had replaced countless times over the years. This one carried an unfamiliar addition beneath the feeding schedule. Keep her breathing until Clara comes home. Clara read the sentence twice before convincing herself it referred only to the starter itself. Even so, the wording settled uneasily beside every other unanswered question. That afternoon she carried the original construction ledger from the office upstairs into the kitchen. The building plans matched the visible walls almost perfectly until they reached the brick oven. There, the elevation drawing showed a maintenance corridor extending several feet behind the warming chamber before ending at solid masonry. Yet when Clara compared the measurements herself, the distance between the rear kitchen wall and the oven foundation was nearly 16 inches greater than the drawings allowed. The discrepancy was too small to notice casually and too large to dismiss as simple drafting error. The repaired mortar, the hollow brickwork, the repeatedly removed hinge, the warm masonry, the paid flour deliveries, and the note tied to the living starter no longer pointed in different directions. They were beginning to describe one deliberate pattern. Standing quietly beside the oven with the linen cloth folded over her hands, Clara looked toward the warming chamber once more, suddenly certain that whatever had kept the final loaf warm had begun long before her grandmother disappeared. The discrepancy in the measurements refused to leave Clara alone. She waited until the bakery closed for the evening, locked the front door, and carried the original building plans, a tape measure, her work lamp, and the cream-colored linen cloth back into the cellar. This time she was not searching for a hidden room. She was testing whether the building itself agreed with its own history. Beginning at the western foundation wall, she measured every exposed section of brick exactly as the 1919 drawings indicated. Every dimension matched within less than half an inch until she reached the warming chamber beneath the brick oven. There the numbers drifted again. 16 inches existed in the building that did not exist on paper. Instead of forcing the repaired mortar, she studied the maintenance details Margaret had always insisted mattered more than appearances. The ventilation duct, the removable ash cleanout, the iron service hatch beneath the warming chamber. None had been damaged. All showed careful maintenance over many years. Only the brass hinge on the cellar door carried repeated removal marks. Clara climbed back upstairs, removed the hinge pin with a screwdriver instead of prying at the old wood, then eased the heavy door away from its frame. Resting behind the lower hinge mortise was a folded strip of yellowed tracing paper protected inside waxed baker's parchment. It was not hidden from strangers. It had been hidden from anyone who never thought to preserve the door before removing it. She spread the tracing paper across the linen cloth on the work table. The fragile sheet contained a hand-drawn service diagram of the original oven, different from the county plans. A narrow inspection passage had been built behind the warming chamber, so brickwork could be repaired without dismantling the baking floor. Decades earlier, someone had carefully sealed the entrance during a renovation, leaving only the maintenance dimensions behind. Following the drawing, Clara returned to the cellar and located a shallow cast-iron access plate concealed beneath a removable flour storage shelf that matched the repaired section of floorboards above. It lifted smoothly, its bolts lightly coated with fresh food-grade grease rather than rust. Someone had maintained it until very recently. Beyond the opening lay a narrow brick passage scarcely wide enough for one person. There was no treasure waiting inside. Instead, she found shelves lined with labeled bakery ledgers, flour delivery receipts stretching back decades, maintenance journals, several carefully indexed cassette tapes, and a small oak box wrapped in the familiar cream-colored linen cloth she had carried all week. Her hand stopped before opening it. The cloth around the box had been stitched by hand years earlier, and embroidered in one corner, almost invisible beneath faded thread, were two words she had never seen before: for Clara. Clara did not touch the bundle marked for Clara until she had documented everything else inside the hidden passage. She carried each ledger upstairs one at a time, photographing its cover, noting its year, then placing it on the broad maple work table in careful order. The flour delivery receipts formed one stack. The maintenance journals formed another. The cassette tapes remained in their labeled envelopes. Only after every record rested where she could see it did she unfold the cream-colored linen cloth across the table and gently place the small oak box in its center. The cloth no longer felt like something rescued from her childhood. It had become part of the work itself, protecting every brittle page from the rough grain beneath. She lifted the lid. Inside lay no fortune, no deed, no dramatic confession. Instead, she found neatly wrapped packets of recipe cards, bundles of handwritten notes tied with cotton string, and several yearly inventories written in Margaret's familiar hand. Clara began with the inventories because they were the most ordinary. Every October, Margaret had listed flour, salt, yeast, wood for the oven, replacement bricks, lamp batteries, cleaning supplies, and linen. Beside each item appeared brief comments that seemed practical at first glance. Replace cracked peel handle. Inspect chimney after first frost. Order extra rye before snow. Yet one pattern slowly emerged. For nearly 12 consecutive years, Margaret had written the same final reminder at the bottom of each autumn inventory. Keep enough for one more baker. No name followed. Clara first assumed the note referred to a future employee. Then she compared the inventories with the flour ledgers Ethan's family had supplied. The quantities marked one more baker never entered payroll records. No additional wages had ever been paid. Whoever Margaret had been preparing for was never meant to be hired. The extra flour, the additional linen, the spare apron listed every few years, even the replacement work shoes recorded in one inventory had all remained untouched. They had been waiting. Clara sat back without speaking. Her grandmother had not been stockpiling supplies out of habit. She had been preserving the bakery at a size large enough for 2 people, long after only one person worked there. The realization answered one question while opening another. Margaret had expected someone to stand beside her. Why had she believed that for so many years? Clara untied the next bundle. It contained maintenance checklists rather than recipes. Each inspection matched what Clara herself had already discovered: the clean ventilation channels, the removable cellar door, the hidden service passage behind the warming chamber, the carefully greased access plate. Nothing had been neglected. Then one familiar detail quietly changed meaning. Margaret never described the passage as a hiding place. Every checklist called it the preservation corridor. The phrase appeared again and again over almost 30 years. Clara looked toward the brick oven through the open kitchen doorway. Until now, she had imagined the passage existed to conceal records. The journals suggested the opposite. The records had been stored there because it was the driest, most temperature-stable place in the entire building. The passage protected memory the same way the oven protected bread, through steady warmth and patient care rather than secrecy. She reached for one of the cassette tapes labeled Simply Autumn Closing, threaded it into the old player, and listened as Margaret's calm voice filled the quiet bakery. There was no hidden confession. Margaret spoke while completing ordinary end-of-season tasks, describing shelves that needed dusting, bricks that required inspection, and the importance of feeding the starter before locking the door each evening. Halfway through the recording, she paused long enough for another sound to become clear: the gentle crackle of fresh bread cooling somewhere nearby. Clara recognized it instantly. It was the very sound she had heard on the afternoon she returned. For the first time since entering the bakery, she understood that the crackling loaf had never been meant to frighten anyone. It had always been the sound Margaret associated with a day successfully finished and quietly prepared for another to begin. The recording ended with nothing more dramatic than the scrape of a wooden chair and the soft click of the bakery door closing for the night. Clara let the silence remain. She had expected hidden instructions or a final confession. Instead, Margaret had left behind something far more difficult to dismiss. Years of ordinary routines repeated with extraordinary consistency. She opened the oldest ledger once more and began comparing every autumn inventory with the flour receipts and the maintenance journals. The pattern held through every year. Whenever the bakery earned a little more than expected, Margaret never expanded the storefront or purchased newer equipment. She repaired worn hinges, replaced cracked oven bricks, renewed ventilation seals, bought extra linen, and ordered enough flour for 2 bakers instead of 1. She had invested almost nothing in appearances and nearly everything in continuity. Clara thought about the regional cafe chain that wanted the property. They would have replaced the brick oven within weeks because it was inefficient by modern standards. Margaret had known that. Suddenly, the preservation corridor, the carefully serviced warming chamber, and the hidden records no longer felt like separate decisions. They were all protecting the same thing. Not old paper. Not even the building itself. They were protecting a way of working that could only survive if someone who understood it eventually returned. Clara untied the final bundle of recipe cards. Most contained familiar formulas she had learned as a child. each covered with small practical notes. Reduce water during dry October mornings. Rotate rye dough sooner after the first frost. Never rush a loaf because customers could always wait longer than bread. Then she noticed another quiet habit. Every few years, Margaret had rewritten exactly the same recipes by hand instead of simply using the older cards. The measurements barely changed. The handwriting grew slower, but the recipes remained alive because they were copied, practiced, and passed forward instead of preserved untouched. Clara recognized the lesson immediately. Her grandmother had never believed preservation meant freezing something in time. Preservation meant keeping it useful until another pair of hands could continue the work. She reached for the cream-colored linen cloth and laid one of the rewritten recipe cards beside its faded embroidery. The stitches matched the thread Margaret had used to repair worn aprons throughout Clara's childhood. The cloth, the recipes, the journals, and the bakery itself all carried the same philosophy. Things meant to serve others were cared for through use, not display. For the first time since returning to Vermont, Clara felt the weight she had carried for years begin to shift. She had believed leaving home proved she mattered less with every passing season. The evidence spread across the table quietly argued the opposite. Margaret had behaved as though Clara's return was uncertain, but never impossible. Every repaired hinge, every fresh sack of flour, every maintained air passage, every carefully fed starter culture had extended the bakery's life one season longer. Not because Margaret knew when Clara would come home, but because she refused to let home disappear before she did. Clara folded the linen cloth around the recipe cards only long enough to carry them safely back into the oak box. Then she unfolded it again and returned it to the work table where bread would be shaped. It no longer belonged beside hidden records. It belonged beside living dough. As she replaced the final ledger, one loose sheet drifted gently onto the table. It was not a letter. It was next week's production schedule, written in Margaret's hand only days before she vanished. Beside Monday's first batch of sourdough, one line had been added in quiet pencil beneath the usual baking notes. Leave the first loaf for Clara. She will know where to begin. Clara read the penciled note beneath the production schedule twice before setting it gently beside the other records. Leave the first loaf for Clara. She will know where to begin. The sentence carried no urgency, no explanation, and no farewell. It sounded exactly like every practical instruction Margaret had ever written inside the bakery. Yet placed beside the ledgers, the maintenance journals, the flour orders, and the carefully preserved passage behind the oven, it changed the meaning of everything Clara thought she understood. Until that moment, she had believed her grandmother's preparations were meant to preserve the bakery itself. Now another possibility emerged. Perhaps the bakery had been preserved because it was the only place capable of carrying a message too large for a single letter. Clara resisted the temptation to search for another hidden compartment. The answer would not come from finding more evidence. It would come from understanding the evidence already spread across the maple table. She carried the yearly inventories beside the flour ledgers and arranged them month by month instead of year by year. A different pattern immediately appeared. Every unusually large flour order arrived during the last weeks of October. Every major maintenance inspection of the oven happened within days of those deliveries. Every replacement of the linen cloth, oven peel, proofing baskets, or ventilation seals followed the same seasonal rhythm. Margaret had never been preparing for random emergencies. She had been preparing for another baking season. Clara turned to the maintenance journals again and noticed something she had overlooked before. None of the inspections ended with the words completed or finished. Margaret always wrote ready. Ready for winter. Ready for harvest. Ready for another year. Ready for 2 bakers. The language belonged to someone waiting rather than someone closing a chapter. Clara looked toward the starter culture resting quietly in its glass crock near the fermentation room. She remembered the tag tied around its neck. Keep her breathing until Clara comes home. Earlier, she had assumed the sentence referred to the living culture. Then she believed it described the bakery. Now, standing between the warm brick oven and the work table covered with records, she realized Margaret may have intended both meanings at once. The starter, the oven, and the bakery were never separate in her grandmother's mind. As long as one remained alive, the others could begin again. Clara fed the starter with fresh flour and warm water, recording the feeding time in the new ledger beneath Margaret's final entry. She paused before closing the book. Every previous page had been written by her grandmother's steady hand. For the first time, Clara's handwriting continued the same record instead of beginning a different one. The gesture was almost invisible, yet it carried more weight than signing any legal document could have. Across the room, the brick oven released another quiet crackle as its stored warmth settled through the old masonry. Days earlier, Clara had heard the same sound and believed it marked an impossible mystery. Now she heard something else. It was the familiar voice of a place that had never stopped doing exactly what it had been built to do: patiently hold warmth until someone was ready to use it again. Even so, one question remained. If Margaret had spent years preparing a path home instead of hiding secrets, why had she chosen to disappear before Clara walked through the bakery door? The answer, Clara sensed, was no longer hidden behind the bricks. It was waiting somewhere inside the ordinary routines Margaret had repeated until the very end. Clara left the ledger open and walked slowly through the bakery without carrying a single document with her. For the first time since returning to Vermont, she wanted to see the building without searching for another clue. Morning light slipped through the front windows and rested across the flour-dusted floorboards. The display shelves, though nearly empty, still stood exactly where Margaret had left them. The cooling rack beside the brick oven waited for bread that had not yet been baked. Nothing inside the room suggested abandonment anymore. It suggested interruption. That distinction settled quietly inside Clara as she crossed into the fermentation room. She paused beside the glass crock that held the family sourdough starter. Tiny bubbles rose steadily beneath its pale surface, exactly as they should after feeding. She remembered how many times she had watched Margaret perform the same simple task without ever calling it important. Bread was never kept alive through dramatic moments. It survived because someone returned every day to do ordinary work. Clara suddenly understood why every maintenance journal, inventory, and flour order sounded so calm. Margaret had never been writing instructions for someone solving a mystery. She had been leaving behind a rhythm that another baker could step into without fear. Carrying the starter back into the kitchen, Clara placed it beside the cream-colored linen cloth. Their quiet companionship caught her attention. The cloth protected what rested beneath it. The starter preserved what could not simply be remade. One guarded memory. The other carried life forward. Together they described the same promise without using a single sentimental word. Clara reached for the oldest maintenance journal once more and compared its inspection dates with the recordings from the cassette tapes. Each autumn inspection happened just before Margaret recorded the bakery's seasonal closing routine. Every spring inspection came immediately before the first community bread bake of the year. The service passage behind the oven had never been maintained because something valuable was hidden there. It had been maintained because the bakery itself depended upon it. The records had simply been entrusted to the safest place Margaret knew. Clara smiled faintly at the realization. She had spent days believing she was uncovering a secret room. In truth, she had been discovering how carefully her grandmother had separated secrecy from stewardship. One concealed the truth. The other protected it until the right hands could understand it. The hidden passage had always belonged to the second kind. She rewound the final minutes of the autumn cassette and listened again, not to Margaret's voice, but to everything surrounding it. The scrape of a flour bin being closed. The quiet clink of the oven peel returning to its rack. The steady ticking of the wall clock. Finally, the gentle crackle of cooling bread. Then, after several long seconds of silence, Margaret spoke one final sentence almost as though she were reminding herself rather than anyone else. Tomorrow always begins tonight. Clara stopped the tape. The words were not a farewell. They were a baker's habit. Every loaf sold tomorrow began with dough mixed the night before. Every season depended on preparation that no customer would ever see. Every act of care inside this bakery had quietly belonged to someone the future might never thank. At last, the pattern became complete. Margaret had never been preparing for her own final days. She had been preparing for Clara's first day back. The warm loaf waiting on the cooling rack, the flour already paid for, the living starter, the preserved records, the serviced oven, and even the folded linen cloth were not separate gifts. Together they formed one continuous path leading home. Clara rested her hands on the worn maple work table and looked toward the brick oven once more. She finally understood the surface truth with complete certainty. Margaret had not disappeared because she wished to leave Clara behind. She had made certain the bakery could welcome Clara even in her absence. Yet one question remained untouched. If every practical detail had been prepared so carefully, why had Margaret chosen to leave without allowing Clara a chance to say goodbye? That unanswered choice, more than any hidden passage or forgotten record, would determine whether Clara could truly understand the woman who had quietly spent years keeping a place alive for someone she never stopped expecting to return. The next morning, Clara unlocked the bakery before sunrise, just as Margaret had done for decades. Nothing had changed overnight, yet everything felt different because she no longer walked through the rooms searching for what had been hidden. Instead, she moved through them understanding what had been preserved. She folded the cream-colored linen cloth across the maple work table, fed the starter culture, and checked the warmth of the brick oven with the back of her hand. Each action belonged naturally to the next, as though she were stepping into a rhythm that had never truly been interrupted. The bakery did not ask her to become Margaret. It only asked her to continue the care that Margaret had refused to let disappear. Clara carried the ledgers and maintenance journals back through the preservation corridor one final time. She returned every record to the oak box exactly as she had found it, arranging the bundles in their original order before lowering the lid. Nothing there needed to be displayed behind glass or announced as a remarkable discovery. Their purpose had already been fulfilled. They had guided the one person Margaret hoped would eventually understand them. Before leaving the passage, Clara rested her fingertips against the old brick wall that had quietly guarded generations of work, instead of generations of secrets. Then she closed the concealed access, replaced the flower shelf, and left the corridor to continue doing what it had always done: protect the bakery without asking for attention. Upstairs, Ethan Cole arrived with the week's flour delivery. He paused at the doorway, studying the open windows, the warmed oven, and the familiar smell of fresh dough rising once again. Clara smiled before he could ask the question both of them already knew. "Keep the standing order," she said simply. Ethan nodded without surprise. No congratulations were necessary. The decision had already been made long before either of them spoke it aloud. After he left, Clara opened a fresh page in the current bakery ledger beneath Margaret's final production schedule. She did not write about hidden passages or old records. She entered only the things that mattered to the next day: flour received, starter fed, oven inspected, first dough mixed. At the bottom of the page, she added one quiet sentence in the same careful spirit Margaret had always used: "Ready for tomorrow." She folded the linen cloth over the first round of rising bread and stepped back. Once, the cloth had represented the childhood she believed she had lost forever. Later it became evidence that someone had remembered her. Now it had become something simpler and far more lasting. It was no longer a keepsake from the past. It was a tool for the future, used by hands that had finally stopped protecting themselves from belonging somewhere. As the morning light spread across the bakery, the first loaf emerged from the brick oven with a gentle crackle that echoed through the quiet room. Days earlier, that sound had seemed impossible, almost asking Clara to chase an answer hidden inside old walls. This time it carried no mystery at all. She placed the warm loaf on the wooden cooling rack, covered it lightly with the cream-colored linen cloth, unlocked the front door, and welcomed the first customer of the morning into a bakery that had never been waiting for a secret to be discovered. It had been waiting for its baker to come home.